Today we're going to continue our discussion about communities. There's still quite a few aspects of communities that we have yet to cover, and I also want to go back and take a look at some of the topics we covered in our last episode and do a little reviewing. Today I want to talk about how it is that communities are put together. And I also want to discuss further the issue of interactions between species that live within communities. We might be able to also, at the very end of our discussion today, get to our topic of biomes. Let's first consider this community that we're looking at here. This is a salt marsh community, relatively simple in terms of numbers of species that occur in it. There are a few species of grasses that you see in this picture here, and there are also certain kinds of animals that live in this environment, and the kinds of animals vary with season. You're looking at a greater yellowlegs, a species that only comes through in the spring and fall in these areas to feed in the shallow areas that occur within them. Salt marshes, by the way, are environments found on the coast that are inundated daily with tidal salt water, although they also tend to have the salt water diluted by an inflow of fresh water from the uplands. Now, in addition to the species you see here, there are also smaller things that live in that water. There are various kinds of little fishes, there are shrimps, there are crabs, and then there's a whole group of organisms that live in the mud below that water. And all these organisms form the salt marsh community. Let's consider then the topic of community assembly. In other words, how do you put together a community? How do you fit together the various species that occur within the community? Well, one thing that we notice is that when you have the same kinds of physical environment, the same kinds of species tend to show up in it. So, for example, we can find salt marshes all up and down the east coast of North America, all the way up to Prince Edward Island in Canada, and all the way down to northern Florida. Now, to be sure, environments do vary across that vast length. However, there are some factors, some general kinds of factors that all these areas have in common. They all have quiet water where sediments can accumulate. They all have a brackish water environment, an area, in other words, where fresh water dilutes seawater. They're all subjected to tides. And so, despite the dissimilarity over that distance, there are some general kinds of similarities in the physical environment that lead to a rather similar kind of community developing in all of them. Some of the species from one end of that range to the other differ, but some of them are the same. Now, as we've seen, species that live within these communities may interact with each other. If you look at this field here, and you look at all those Queen Anne's laces, the white flowers, and all those black-eyed Susans, the yellow flowers, I think it's a pretty reasonable assumption that those species are coming into competition in this field, competing over space. By the way, the black-eyed Susan is a native North American species, whereas the Queen Anne's lace is a Eurasian species. So this is an interaction that's only been going on for a few hundred years here in North America. But in any event, I think in situations like that we can say that certainly interactions occur, but other species although they may live in the same area, they may be different enough in their niches that they really don't have much in the way of interaction. Now, for those species that do have the capacity to interact, interaction, as we saw with water thrushes in our last slideshow, and we'll be coming back to them shortly, those species will only come into some sort of negative interaction like competition when there is something to compete over. So we've already talked a bit about the competitive exclusion principle. When two species are identical and they compete over some resource, then one species tends to replace the other. And this has been demonstrated again and again in the laboratory. In the natural world, it's not always quite so clear, and the water thrushes were an example of that. One last issue to consider under the heading of community assembly is that communities can vary in terms of how distinct the boundaries between them can be. A salt marsh tends to have a rather distinct boundary. For example, when the salt water and tides go away, the salt marsh goes away, and then you are into a very distinctly different upland community. However, that's not always the case. Communities can also blend into each other. Let's see an example of that. Here we are in the southern Appalachians, a place that we've visited a few times for several different reasons. This is the place where much of what is called gradient analysis was first done. In fact, one of my graduate advisors was one of the people who was involved doing this gradient analysis in this very area here. The idea is that communities can grade from one to another, and you actually can see that happening in this picture. If you look at all those pale green trees, that's where spring is down in the valley there. And in addition to telling us it's spring, it also tells us what kind of trees we're looking at. Those first trees to come out and get green in the spring are maples. Most of those would be red maples and sugar maples. And so we can see the distribution of those maples in the early spring very clearly when we stand up on a peak and take a photograph like this. And if you follow the occurrence of those maples up the hillsides into the mountains, you notice that they just kind of trickle out. So that deciduous forest community of those cool valleys gets replaced by other species as we go up the mountains. Species that start to replace them at the coldest elevations would be things like red spruce, and in this location it would be Fraser fir, a species found only in the southern Appalachians. So we're going from that deciduous forest to a boreal forest kind of a community as we get to the highest elevations here. But even before we get to that, there is this turnover in species going on as we go up the mountain as well. And so that falls under the heading of communities grading into each other. Here is a slide that summarizes that. The idea that as physical environments change, communities will also be changing. So species with different ecological niches will appear and replace species whose niches are no longer present in this new physical environment. Now, here's a different kind of an example from southern New England of this environmental gradient kind of phenomenon. Pretty much any small hill in southern New England that's forested will show a turnover in communities from the bottom of the hill to the top of the hill. Because even though it might only be a short distance, the physical environments do alter. So at the bottom of the hill, that tends to be the area where water might collect, especially on a north-facing slope. Tends to be damper down there, cooler, because if you recall, cool air is denser than warm air, and so cool air is going to sink. When we just have a little hill, you're not going to get into altitudinal cooling, so it becomes a bit counterintuitive unless you think about it carefully. The bottom of the hill is cooler than the top of the hill. So anyway, in that kind of an environment in southern New England, you tend to get the development of wetland communities, swampy areas, maybe swampy streams where you have hemlock trees and white pine trees and red maples, which are tolerant of wet conditions, and maybe yellow birch. And then as we head up the hill, things become less wet. They might still be moist, and they also tend to be comparatively nutrient-rich sites because when it rains, gravity trickling through the soil, that water is going to pick up nutrients in the soil and bring them to lower slopes on the hill. And so the more nutrient-rich kinds of communities on a hill do tend to be toward the bottom. And so we might find sugar maples and yellow birches and other kinds of species like white ash that like more nutrient-rich kinds of situations. Then as we travel further up the hill, it does tend to get on average warmer. It also tends to get drier and more nutrient poor. And in those kinds of situations, the sugar maples and so on, they don't like that. It's outside of their ecological niche, so they drop out. And what replaces them are species of oaks that are capable of tolerating that environment. And so we find things like chestnut oak and scarlet oak and a few other species like that. The shrub layer of the forest tends to be dominated with huckleberries, which is another dry site and poor site indicator. And so, although those communities don't have distinct boundaries, they do grade into each other as the environmental conditions grade as you go from the bottom to the top of the hill. When interactions do occur between community members, they tend to fall under these headings. And we've already talked some about the first one, the idea of competition. I have a few more things to say about it, but we'll do that in a bit. Competition, in a general way, means negative interactions between species who are using the same resource. If it involves competition between separate species, then we have interspecific competition. But competition can also occur within species. That's referred to as intraspecific competition. Another kind of an interaction that occurs within communities is predation, where one organism feeds on another. And we can even extend that idea to animals feeding on plants. When animals do things like eat seeds, they're often referred to as seed predators. Usually we tend to reserve the term predator for one animal eating another animal, but it doesn't have to be reserved to just that. There are some terms that relate specifically to feeding on plants, like herbivory. So herbivores are animals that eat plants, whereas carnivores are animals that eat other animals. Detritivores are still another class, and these are organisms that feed on the dead remains of other organisms. Now, interactions don't have to simply be negative. They can also be positive. Certain kinds of symbiotic relationships, for example, can be positive. The term symbiosis is a general kind of a term that relates to interactions between organisms. Instances of positive interaction include things like commensalism, where one species in a relationship benefits and the other species with which it interacts is unharmed. Mutualism is another class where when two species interact, both gain benefit. Still, another kind of relationship, however, is parasitism, in which one species benefits and one does not. So that's a negative kind of symbiotic relationship. One last term that I'll introduce here is the term allelopathy, which is that situation where one species can actually poison an environment for another. It is particularly common among plants. A species like the butternut tree, which is native to much of eastern North America, the butternut can poison an area surrounding it for certain other tree species. I have a butternut in my yard, in fact, and I planted another tree too close to it, and it killed it over a period of about a year or so. Now let's focus on a specific example of interspecific competition. We're looking here at the island of Tinian from the island of Saipan in the western tropical Pacific. Now, the island of Tinian is notable for many reasons, among them being this is where the plane took off to drop the atomic bomb on Japan at the end of World War II. But it also is notable for a number of natural history reasons. It has on it an endemic species of bird that is a bird that's only found there. At least historically. Prehistorically, it's likely that it did occur on other islands, but was driven to extinction by prehistoric people when they first colonized these islands. This bird is the Tinian monarch. It is a kind of a flycatcher. Flycatchers are kinds of birds that do exactly what their name suggests that they would do. They fly off from perches and catch bugs. Now, this species is, compared to a lot of flycatchers, including the other flycatcher which is present on this island, is fairly good sized and aggressive. And so it is socially dominant over the other species that occurs there, the rufous fantail. The fantail on the island of Tinian is pretty much relegated to the lower part of the forest understory, whereas the Tinian monarch is pretty much found in the treetops, a place where most of the leaves are and most likely most of the bugs are. Now, on the adjacent island of Saipan, the Tinian monarch does not occur, only the rufous fantail. And on that island, the rufous fantail uses not just the forest understory, but also the forest canopy. So this strongly suggests that the competition that occurs for food on this island between the monarch and the fantail results in the fantail having its niche contracted. So we can summarize all that like this. Where these two species co-occur, the Tinian monarch reduces the fundamental niche of the rufous fantail to a realized niche of only the forest understory. Where the monarch is absent, the fantail expands its niche to its fundamental niche, or something resembling that. We can't really know for sure without further study, to occupy the entire forest. And this brings us back to our old friends, the water thrushes. And we can make the point with them that niche overlap alone is not enough to bring species into competition. In order for species to come into competition, there must be some resource in limited supply, something to compete over, in other words. And so, with these species, even though they overlap in many niche dimensions, they still appear to compete little because the resources are not in limited supply. Now there's other issues that I haven't really touched on with these species. That relates to population size and what controls population size. These are migratory birds, and they occur with us in North America only in the summer. And with many of these long-distance migrants, many of these species that migrate to South America, things that happen on the wintering ground can actually determine population size. And so if populations are kept below carrying capacity of the habitat, that again is another factor that can lead to niches being very similar, but competition not occurring. So the more you look at situations like these in ecology, the more clear it becomes how complicated they really are. Now we have one more slide in order to finish up our discussion of competition. We've looked pretty thoroughly at the issue of interspecific competition, but we have yet to consider intraspecific competition. That is, competition within a species. So within a species, males might compete with other males for mates, or pairs of individuals might compete over living space. In fact, that's why most little birds, most songbirds, defend what are called territories. Territories are areas that are for the exclusive use of a particular mated pair, and they defend it against intruders. So the existence of territoriality is an example of intraspecific competition. Now, interestingly enough, although birds, especially songbirds, do tend to be territorial, animals like mammals tend not to be. And that's because it costs a lot more calories than it costs birds to get around. Mammals walk, birds fly, and flying is energetically less expensive than walking. And so it is thought that is a limiting factor to the development of territoriality among mammals. There are some mammals that exhibit territoriality. For example, in the northeastern part of North America, the red squirrel is territorial. Red squirrels live primarily in conifers, and conifers have a dense source of seeds. Evergreen trees, like pines and spruces and species like that, have this dense collection of pine cones. And so red squirrels don't have to expend so much energy moving around to defend that. And so in that instance, it's kind of the exception in mammals that proves the rule about the importance of energetics in influencing the occurrence of intraspecific competition. Before I introduce the concept of biomes, let me say a few words about this topic here, keystone species. Keystone species are those that have some critical major impact on the functioning of a community. So they are not necessarily the most abundant species, but they have some inordinate importance in terms of overall ecosystem function. Now, truthfully, I have some problems with this concept of keystone species because I find it to be rather a subjective kind of an idea. What you want to call a keystone species is kind of in the eye of the beholder. But as a general rule of thumb, it's not a completely unreasonable idea to talk about. We can certainly think of instances where particular species do have a major impact. I picked out a few that many ecologists might not pick out because of my own personal perspective here. So I pick out the ovenbird, which in northeastern parts of North America is the most abundant bird in the forest. It accounts for much of the animal biomass in communities of which it is a part. It therefore can be associated with consuming an enormous number of things like insects within an environment. And we might be able to think of a whole variety of other sorts of things that are consequences of its sheer abundance as well. In the Middle Atlantic states and into southern New England, the white oak is also a species of inordinate importance. In fact, I would say that oaks in general in forest ecosystems have some substantial impact, both because of the food that they produce, acorns, which are eaten by a whole variety of different kinds of wildlife, everything from insects all the way up to white-tailed deer can derive a significant portion of their annual calories from acorns. Aside from that, it provides a substrate that animals live on, and for that matter, other kinds of organisms live on. Microorganisms and things like moss and algae and blue-green algae, better known as cyanobacteria. A whole host of different kinds of organisms live on these trees. Now, more typically, when one talks about keystone species, one talks about things like top predators, like maybe this long-eared owl, or perhaps a timber wolf, or something like that. So, in any event, now you've heard of this term, and let's introduce briefly our next major topic, that of biomes. Now, we've been talking about communities and various kinds of processes that go on within communities. But communities occur within bigger units. They occur within these entities called biomes. Biomes we can define like this: major geographic regions of the world that are defined on the basis of their dominant plant growth. And of course, the kinds of plants that grow in an area are determined in turn by climate and topography. And under the heading of climate, temperature and rainfall are particularly important in determining what kinds of prevailing plant life an area has. But topography and soils can also influence the distribution of organisms. So particular kinds of landforms, mountainous regions, low-lying regions, particular soils like sandy soils or very rich soils and things like that, those can also influence on a large scale what kinds of major groupings of organisms occur. The world's major climatic zones have a profound influence on biomes. So we can talk about the boreal zone with mean temperatures less than 5 Celsius, and the temperate zone with mean temperatures above 5 to less than 20 Celsius, and tropical zone with temperatures generally above 20 Celsius. Now we could subdivide these further. We could subdivide the boreal zone and so on. But if we want to look at a simplistic kind of a division of the world's major climatic zones, we could just talk about these three for starters. And so that's what we are going to investigate in quite a bit of detail in our next program.